You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast, where we challenge the status quo of the food industry, celebrate good food founders who are building businesses on their own terms, introduce industry disruptors, and are redefining equitability. If you're ready to build your financial confidence and join the good food revolution to change the way the food industry does business, you are in the right place. I'm the Good Food CFO and your host, Sarah Delavan. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Charlotte Walter, chocolatier and founder of Charlotte Truffles, a chocolate shop celebrating the diversity of our community through chocolates. Before starting her good food business, Charlotte was actually a manufacturing process engineer in the medical device industry. That background has served her well and informed the process of expanding her unique chocolate offerings and her team. In this episode, Charlotte is sharing her 4-phase process for scaling your production, from R&D through defining your quality metrics to hiring your first employee and ensuring that you have everything in place to produce on a large scale, either internally or with a co-packer. I'm so happy to have Charlotte here on the podcast, and I'm excited for you to listen in. Let's get to it. Charlotte, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this conversation because so many of our community members are in a growth phase. And so many of the listeners of this podcast are in a growth phase for their food businesses where they are, expanding their teams and increasing their production capacity, whether that's internally with an in-house manufacturing system or externally by onboarding a co-packer. And that comes with a lot of considerations and some work to do to really get it right. And I know you've grown your team at Charlotte Truffles, and you're also uniquely qualified to talk about this topic because of your background. Can you share a little bit with us about what you did before starting your good food business?
Yeah. Prior to starting my chocolate shop, I actually worked as a manufacturing engineer / process engineer / operations in the medical device industry for about 12 years. And we worked in several products. And one of the products was we took the product or / design from an R&D phase all the way to a phase where it's ready for mass production.
Yeah. What was your role in that process?
So it's transition. Talking about my last experience at my corporate job, the first role when I came in, it was more of a process engineer. So really being able to assist that particular team to prepare for production. And then as the project evolved, I became more of a manufacturing engineer. And then toward the end, it was more of an operations person.
Gotcha. So I'm sure this question is on everyone's mind. How does medical device operations compare to food production?
Really, there's not that much of a difference. It's really just the tangible product is different. Obviously, med device is products for the humans, and then for food is food. In general, though, we really do cover, I would say, 4 different chapters of the project, where you go through these phases so you can be ready for mass production, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah. And that's an important point as we kind of talk through this, is considering you as a listener, where are you in the 4 phases, but also what type of business are you wanting to grow? I think will play a part in perhaps how many phases you go through, but we'll talk about that in more detail. So why don't we start by just naming the 4 phases so that we know kind of what the overarching journey is, and then we'll dive into each one.
Sure. So the first phase, I like to call it more of an R&D phase. And so this is really defining what you're ultimately wanting to produce as a business. So an example is you want to just produce jam. The second chapter is really defining what makes your product different from the others in terms of quality metrics.
Mm.
And we can talk about that more in detail a little later. And then the third chapter or phase is more of being able to produce your product in a larger batch. This is usually happens after you define exactly what your customer needs and wants are, and you're now wanting to kind of increase that capacity to meet, for example, farmers market demands and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last chapter or phase is more about the activities around getting ready for mass production. And as you mentioned earlier, that could look like mass production within your in-house capacity, like your own production team, or transitioning that to a co-packer.
Yeah. Super helpful. And as you were describing that, I could see the life of a food business, right? That first phase is like, I have this idea, right?
Exactly.
And what is my product? And then making those first few batches, right? And kind of figuring out, what is my product? And like you're saying, how is it different? I was thinking about a pasta client that I have, and it's like knowing exactly how the pasta should feel, when it's being extruded from the machine, so then when it cooks for 9 minutes, let's say, it has this exact like texture that is unique to that brand. And then instead of making a single batch by hand, then growing to the next phase where you are making that larger batch and then ultimately deciding and then becoming either a larger manufacturer or outsourcing that. So I can totally see that journey. And I could see the similarities if you're doing the same things in medical device. Like clearly, we're doing those same things in food.
Yeah.
So I think, one of the reasons I was really excited about having this conversation with you here on the podcast is because I know a lot of people, as I said, our community, our listeners are in a growth phase and are expanding. And when we started talking about this kind of offline a couple weeks back, you really shared some beneficial details about things to consider in each phase. And I just thought, wow, this could be so helpful for people from a financial perspective to make sure that you are making your product efficiently, making it correctly. Like all of these things that we're going to talk about today connect to the financial piece of your business in so many ways. And so I'll maybe try to highlight those as we go, but I just wanted to also plant that seed for our listeners as well.
Yeah. And exactly to your point, the financial capacity that you have or where your goals are is going to be able to dictate some of the tough decisions that you would need to make along the way. So
yeah. All right. So let's dive into the R&D phase, as you called it. What does this look like? What are we doing in this phase in some more detail?
Sure. So in the R&D phase, it's really, you having an idea of what you want to produce, right? And so it's also kind of what I'd like to consider in the feedback loop. So let's say you have an idea that you want to produce jam and you think it's going to be amazing to create this funky jam, but you start trying to expose it to the world outside of your family and you realize that, hey, this funky jam is actually going to be really amazing and people love it. After a certain amount of data points is being collected, you realize I'm going to produce it. Or the outcome could be that, this funky jam is just too funky. so you go back to the drawing board and you realize, okay, maybe I won't mix these two ingredients together and maybe I'll make this into two different products. But ultimately, it's being able to produce a product that the customers need or want while meeting your own desires of what your business would like to offer.
Yeah. Is this the phase where you're essentially solidifying your recipe?
Yes. Also, in some terminology, it's also defining what your MVP is, your minimum viable product.
Okay.
So you don't need it to be super perfect, but you just need it to know that this is the path that we're going to go toward.
Okay.
But the more you further understand what that product looks like or what your customer wants, the more easier it will be to identify some of the criterias in your next chapter.
Okay. So I'm realizing too that you could be in this R&D phase multiple times throughout the
Mhm.
life of your food business because you kind of come back to it each time you think about creating a new product.
Exactly.
Okay.
But every time you come back into the R&D phase, to a certain extent, it becomes easier because you are now understanding who your target audience is and how much you can truly push the envelope or not push the envelope.
Right. So we are determining what I love that MVP product is and sort of solidifying that core recipe that we're going to go with and grow with, hopefully. Are we typically selling our product at this point?
You
Is it
could.
assembly?
I mean, it's obviously very different in the med device world versus the food, but I
Yeah.
think you could. I mean, this is probably the first year or so, depending on how fast you grow, obviously. But it's more about your own comfort zone too, realizing that, hey, I think I have a product that I can really stand behind in terms of me as a founder, but also me as a company and as a brand.
Right.
And this is kind of like the story that I'm willing to like pour out to the public.
Yeah. When do you know that you're ready to move to phase 2?
It's it is kind of a blurred line. So once you've realized that you can produce it consistently, then you can start working on identifying what your metrics are. I mean, it could go really hand in hand because you can come in, let's take cookies, for example. I'm really wanting to do classic cookies, but my definition of classic cookies is something that is super, super soft in the middle. Right. But maybe your definitions of super soft is really different than what the public is. And so you're testing it out there. And then as soon as you realize that, oh, yes, I think the public really does like this definition of super soft, you can start identifying that into your next phase.
So you're really thinking about okay, you want to make a cookie, people like the taste of your cookie, that's sort of the R&D phase. It sounds like to me you're going one step further and going, in the case of a cookie, my cookie is going to be a soft cookie and this is the level of softness that it's going to have. My cookie is going to be 2 inches in diameter, right? Those types of things where like, okay, you've established the taste and now you're really solidifying the product and kind of what makes it unique.
Yeah. And everything that you mentioned is like defining like the 2-inch cookies. Those are more of activities around that second chapter.
Okay.
But if you already know that the public likes my super soft cookies and it's to be large, great. So then that's when you can go in a little bit deeper into the second chapter. Like, what is the definitions of large? 3-inch cookies. And then if this is also the time where you can test it out back into the R&D and say, is 3-inch cookies the perfect size? Or is that considered large to the public? Or is it 5-inch cookies?
Right.
And so, again, it kind of goes back to also what you want your brand to really represent.
Okay.
Right? So maybe 5-inch cookie is too much because I'm also a dietitian, right? And so like large really means 2-inch for me as a dietitian.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So can you lay out for our listeners, like, just to make sure we're clear, what does the work look like in phase 2? Because you said like from the quality and metrics perspective, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding before we move on to phase 3. So we have our product and then we're defining our product in terms of like, so you're saying what it means to you. I'm a dietitian, but I want to put out a cookie. So there are certain metrics around that. And that's what you're solidifying at that point. Okay.
So it's really being able to quantify what your customers truly want from you, not from a qualitative perspective that I want big cookies. That's not going to be helpful for you, nor is it going to be helpful for you when you start hiring team members to produce your product.
Right.
So it's more of a quantitative perspective. You can think of this as a chart, right? Like coming in, customer wants a large cookie. As a business and as my brand stands, Large means 3-inch cookies. The next metric would be I want crispy and I want it to be soft. So that's what the customer wants. Therefore, internally as a company, we want crispy to mean brown, thin on the edges, crunchy. And what we mean on the soft side, it's gooey, chocolate is melting. Therefore, that's what we're aiming for.
Got it. Okay. That made it click for me. So you're really, I'm just like, duh, you said defining your product in the description of the phase, but now I understand it's really defining, like, every cookie that we produce will be golden on the edges, but gooey with melty chocolate in the middle, and will be of this certain size. And so you've developed a standard, and now let's say you as an individual are producing this standardized cookie repetitively at this point.
Yeah. And this metrics is also a combination of, like I said, what your business wants to stand for. But at the same time, if you're a jam company, it could also mean that the regulatory bodies require you to meet certain standards.
Okay.
So like if you're making a jam, in order to have a certain shelf life, maybe you need to have a pH level of a jam at a certain range.
Right.
So that is your quote unquote design output, right? What your jam needs to produce. Ultimately, everything that you've defined in this chapter is what will help you control your operations or your process. And it's easy for you to define it and transfer it, whether it is to your production team or to a contract manufacturers.
Okay.
Sorry, co-packer.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The things are clicking for me now. So you've got your, just sticking with jam for the moment, you got your, interesting jam flavor combination that you're like, okay, people do actually like it. You have your core recipe, but now you need to make sure that the pH is of a certain level. And you might do that on your base recipe and realize we're not there.
Right.
So then you, in phase 2, are tweaking this recipe to get your pH level to where it needs to be, while ensuring that your flavor profiles are what you want them to be, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
And also, when it comes to this particular phase, I want to also share the fact that it's not based on just your products. What would be a great exercise to also consider is how would you ship your product? So from in the med device world, we actually take everything from starting to build the product all the way to when customers receive our product. So if you want to go through that exercise, it's a valuable exercise to have, because you can set your requirement of, I want to ship this gooey cookies to a customer all the way in Maine where it doesn't fall apart.
Right.
Therefore, you can define what are some of the packaging materials that you need to have and how to actually package it such that it would meet that standard.
Yeah. Thinking of another client example, and I talk about seafood a lot here because it's like such a unique example. I think it's really good to illustrate, but you've got frozen fish, right? It's like, how frozen does it need to be, first of all, right? Like to begin with, and then how much ice do you need to pack so that you actually have a viable product once it reaches people, right? It's still frozen and people feel good eating it. Are you making the cookie and it's still going to be gooey when it gets from California to Maine?
Exactly.
Right. So even that, like the freshness, but also like, is it the same eating experience a couple days later?
Exactly.
Yeah. And all of that, of course, just to bring it back to financials for a second, like if you're wanting to grow your business and you're wanting to sell, let's say beyond the farmer's market, these food safety considerations, right? When you're talking about the pH of jam are super important, and you've got to have them in place before you grow. And then when you're talking about customer satisfaction, right? Is your fish arriving still frozen? Is your cookie arriving gooey yet crispy when it gets across the country? All of these things add up to the ability to grow and happy customers, which affects your bottom line in a very positive way, which is exciting.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've worked out all this stuff, And now we, I believe, are ready to start really producing on a larger scale. And I believe that's phase 3. So tell us a little bit about what's happening here.
Yeah. So in phase 3 is that you've already defined exactly what you need to produce, whether it's the jam example or the cookie example, but maybe you've been making these jams on your own, right? And let's say you were only making 5 bottles a week, and you've been tinkering it, you've been figuring it out. In phase 3 or in this chapter, we really are starting to document what it is that we need to do to be able to produce that consistently. Do you have your processes in place, like actually written? Do you know what are some of your criterias for the example of the jam? Can we use extremely ripe strawberry or can we use green strawberries?
Right.
Not that you can have that product consistently, but you need to be able to understand that if there is variations between the batches that you're receiving, what are some of the parameters that you can play around to be able to still meet your ultimate requirement.
Yeah. Thinking about pasta again, or even like a bread maker, if the humidity outside is different one day to the other, your processes indicate what do we do when the humidity is X versus Y, right? And
Exactly.
then at doing the things to ensure we have information and the know-how of how to produce the most consistent product possible.
Yes. And in fact, that's exactly what happens in chocolate.
Right.
So we are completely temperature and like humidity sensitive. So we have one process that we need to do when it is super dry, but we need to add an additional steps if we're working in an extremely high humidity kitchen. Again, you take a look at your product and see if it's acceptable for you by comparing it to the metrics that you've already set in your previous phase, right? Like, are your cookies still gooey when you put it in the oven for a longer period of time because of X, Y, and Z? If not, then you know that phase needs to be ironed out a little bit.
Gotcha. So we are documenting our processes. We are documenting kind of like the inputs. When going back to the jam example, the strawberries need to be fresh. The strawberries need to be red, right? They can't be green. Like that won't produce the outcome we want. So you're really detailing the needs and adjustments potentially that need to be made in order to get a consistent product each time it's made.
Yeah. And you can go really, really deep on this, or you can just keep it super high level and saying like, I'm the type of business that we're okay with variations. Therefore, strawberries being ripe just means red. But if you're wanting it to be super consistent, so you can add additional measure in this inspection when you receive your strawberries and say that I want my strawberries to be at certain redness. Maybe you have a meter where you can test the level of sugar in the strawberries.
Yeah.
And you can say like, I want my level of sugar in the strawberries to be within this range. Therefore, it makes it easier for me in production to keep it consistent at this processes.
Yeah.
So you can go really detailed. And I think the more detailed it is, the more, like I said, the more consistent your processes are and the more consistent your final product is.
Yeah. And that those processes and having that documentation is what allows you to hire a team member and either put them fully in charge of production or have them, on the production team with you and ensure that like you aren't having to keep an eye on every single process or have a hand in every single process, which I think is really key when we're talking about growing food businesses. And, it's fine to be the person who does everything when you're a certain size, but then if you want to continue to grow, it's impossible for you to do everything. So the message I'm receiving here is like, document, Document your procedures, document what you want the outcomes to be, document things like how does the pasta feel? Like how do we determine if the gooiness of the cookie is
Exactly.
correct? How do we determine if the viscosity of the jam is correct, right? Having all of those things so you have clear information for your team member at this point to produce the product as if it were you
Exactly.
every single time. And you also mentioned the level of like specificity with which each of your products kind of comes out of production can vary a little
Right.
bit. And I know during a prior conversation, you had mentioned like if you're a business who a selling point is handmade and artisanal,
Mm-hmm.
having some variation between the look of your product is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're wanting to go into Whole Foods or Walmart or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
large scale, uniformity might be very, very important to your product.
Right. Everything that we've talked about you can also trace it back all the way to the vendors that you're working with. If you need it to be super uniform, then there's another level of vendors that you need to work with. Can they
Mm,
provide you all of those informations that you truly require?
right.
If not, then it's time to search for a new one. But if you're okay, then you can work with a lot of other vendors.
Right. So
Um,
phase 3 or chapter 3 feels like a very important phase because there's both the documentation and if I'm understanding correctly, there's also the transfer um, to another team member or alone or
mhm,
with you. So it's
mhm.
really like the team can be growing here, the production is growing here, and
Yeah.
we're documenting.
Yeah, exactly. And like to really differentiate what in the R&D phase is, you could just have yourself or you and another team member,
Right.
but your business is growing and there's no longer an opportunity for you to do it all by yourself. Therefore, you need to hire team members, and that's where phase 3 and 2 kind of is important.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it easier to train. And then if you are going to achieve phase 4, that's when you start really having a whole production line of people
Yeah. Yeah.
producing.
So can you bullet point the things you would have in place at the end of phase 3
Mm.
that indicates, okay, we are ready to move on to phase 4?
Phase 3 is really making sure that are your processes or your instructions documented.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what are some of the materials that you're working with? And have you defined what the requirements are for each of those materials? Do you know what equipment you'll be using?
Mm,
And what are some of the parameters that you will be using in that equipment? So, for example, if you're making cookies, I could use an oven. Is it a convection oven? Is it a standard oven? What's your temperature? What's your time inside the oven? Where does it get placed in the oven? I mean, this can go really into a rabbit hole, but you can talk about like, do you know your oven is actually producing at the right temperature? If it says 350, is it really 350? And
okay.
then ultimately, your gatekeeper or your quality checks is to really understand when the cookies are coming out of the oven, does that meet my criteria? And
Mm,
what does that criteria mean? Which goes back into your second phase, right? Like,
yep.
I want it to be crispy on the outside. I want it to be 2 inches. I want it to be gooey on the inside. But does that, do you know exactly what that means? Um, from whether it's qualitative or quantitative, so that you can transfer that to somebody else. Because
Right.
your definitions of crispy might be different than, Joe,
Yeah.
Joe's definition.
So we've got all the documentation. We understand what our criteria are. We understand what equipment we're using and how we're using that equipment. We've essentially at this point grown our ability to produce our products. So like our batch size has gotten bigger here and we've
Mm-hmm.
confirmed, okay, we can do this at a larger scale and we know how to keep it consistent. We've got, parameters around an acceptable product and then unacceptable product, both from the inputs and the outputs standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people might stop here. A lot of listeners might stop here, right? Where they've got this internal manufacturing team and they're maybe selling regionally or locally. This is, I think, where a lot of people at the farmers market level might be, of course, depending on how many markets you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you are growing or just simply producing a larger quantity of product, maybe growing to the regional or beyond the regional phase, you're going to need more than one team member.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to potentially need a co-packer. And so this sort of next level of scaling seems like it happens in phase 4 or chapter 4, as we're calling it.
Yes. And phase 4 becomes super easy because you've done all of that work, right? And so now it's all about hiring, and whether that's team members or finding the right co-packer who can truly understand the quality perspective of what your product needs.
Yeah.
If you're going with a co-packer, you're wanting to do some trial runs with them. This is when operations come in. You really strategize, how do you meet the demands of your product? Do you fully transition into your co-packer because you fully trust them, or do you kind of continue to produce internally meaning your team, as the co-packer starts to ramp up, and eventually your internal team becomes your R&D team,
right?
Because you no longer need to produce demands for the market because the co-packer can handle that.
Right.
That's a co-packer's perspective, but I think it's the same case if you have an internal production team. If you have a large enough team members, you would categorize your team as hey, these are my R&D team, who would continue to go through their chapter 1 all the way to chapter 3. And then we're going to have a production team who we know what our orders are coming in at a weekly basis. They're going to be constantly producing. They're going to be, make sure that everything that we've set within the first 3 chapters is consistently applied.
Right.
You don't set it and let it go. You still have to do a lot of check-ins, right? There's a lot of things that you can monitor. Again, from either a co-packer or an internal team member, you can set internal manufacturing criteria based on your financial needs.
Okay.
So for example, I don't want to have more than 5 cases of jams to fail the quality criteria in a quarterly basis. So you have to continue to track that. And when you do realize that it's starting to kind of go off of your standard, you need to revisit it. And you have the R&D team that comes in and says, well, what's happening here? Are the criteria of the strawberries not being applied? Is there changes within the industry and all these other things? And so that you can reset it to your original parameters.
Yeah. I love this. Again, of course, I'm thinking of an example. I'm going back to pasta only because the pasta makers that I work with use different grain, right? So there's, you might be getting durum wheat from one farm for a while, and then due to seasonality or just availability, they have to switch to another farm. And so that durum might have a different grind on it. And I'm sorry to my pasta making clients if I'm not getting all the words right. But just different things, right? Yeah. And so if you insert a new ingredient or an ingredient substitute, I can see how these check-ins are really important, and how important it is to have people on the team who understand, and the documentation of this is the criteria that it should meet. Our durum needs to have the following characteristics, right? And then, based on what this durum is that we're bringing in, then this is how this needs to be produced. So it's almost like a mini R&D situation, or a full-on R&D, to make sure okay, we've checked this, and now we understand the process or procedural changes that have to happen to get that output that we want all of the time. So this is a really important point that you're making, because even if you hand off your production to a co-packer, having criteria that they need to meet helps ensure that your end product is consistent, because at the end of the day, it's on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for like food safety and other things as well.
Exactly. I mean, sorry to keep going back to med device, but in our industry, even if we change to a different co-packer, our internal team actually meets in a quarterly system with our co-packer, making sure that our standards, like you mentioned, from a financial perspective, from a quality perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, is met.
Yeah.
And we review that data point and see like, well, are we still on target, or how are we off?
Yeah.
And then if that does happen, then, like you said, R&D teams come in and reassess it and basically re-verify that everything that you have still meets your requirement. I would say between the third phase and the fourth phase, if uniformity is important to you, it's also probably a good exercise to identify who your suppliers are and who your secondary suppliers are. And your secondary suppliers is not always needed unless if it's your critical item.
Right.
Like in the example of your pasta, your durum flour is probably a critical ingredient. And so you would want to identify a second supplier in case that first supplier is unable to meet it due to whatever reasons.
Yeah. So we're talking about in phase 3, but then really in phase 4, this increase in production. And so that means humans, but then you also mentioned machinery briefly in phase 3. And I would think if you are, obviously the co-packer has their machines already in place, which is why you chose to work with them, one of the reasons. But internally, you may have to decide what machines are the right machines for your production, right? If you're going to keep it in-house, you might have to upgrade your machinery or buy more machinery, just something to consider that would be potentially happening.
Yeah, exactly. Well. I think in general, we try to lock down all of our equipments of what we think we'll be using in high mass productions in phase 3.
Okay.
So that way you're not really duplicating the effort. But again, it's all based on your financial model. For example, in my chocolate world, I can't afford the machineries that the big chocolate shops have, right? So everything is more in the scaled version, and therefore I'm defining it with that.
Right.
And so when I do hit that capacity, then I'll have to revisit phase 3.
Okay.
Right. And then figure it all out, and how does that parameter changes, and then eventually do high production. I know some of food makers, they are making products for big customers, like for example, Whole Foods, right? And they're launching in multiple sites. And because they're producing it in-house, they may need to produce like a HACCP plan. And so being able to identify all the phases and checking off each phases will, help create that HACCP plan so much, like tremendously. Because then you could say like safety is not an issue because I check my jam for every batch that we produce. We take a test and we know that each batch has this particular pH level.
So as you're working through the 4 phases and you are documenting, and it particularly in phase 2, 3, right? Then that helps you make the HACCP plan. Like the questions you're going to be asked, the things you're going to have to verify will already have been documented and verified. That's pretty huge, because I cannot tell you the number of people who need to produce a HACCP plan, and they need to do it fast because they didn't realize they needed to do it before they were able to be on the Whole Foods shelf. So that, again, in my mind, goes directly back to the money. You're affecting your top line if you have to hold off putting your product on a retailer shelf because you don't have the HACCP plan in place. And then number two, sort of financial impact is like, if you need to have this done very quickly, it can take a lot of resources. It can take a lot of money that has to be, handled or spent, I should say, in a very short amount of time, right? To get this HACCP plan completed, submitted, and approved. So I'd love that you mentioned that. I know something that a lot of listeners are working through or about to work through. So I love that you've anchored the value of these 4 phases and what you do in each to having that HACCP plan.
Yeah. And ultimately, ultimately the HACCP plan is how do you prevent your own operations from going haywire, basically, right? So if you have everything documented and you know what your criteria are and how you can control it so that it meets your production needs, you already did 70% of the work.
Right.
Right. And then you still have to obviously produce the HACCP plan, but how are you going to mitigate it? And how are you going to control it? It becomes much easier because you've constantly practiced that when you're producing. I don't know where the requirements of the HACCP plans needs to be submitted, but when we're in the med device world, usually that practice gets done in the 3rd chapter.
Yeah. It's quite same for a food business, because you don't formally need to have it in place unless you are going to sell your product to a certain customer, or and size has something to do with it, right? And exposure. So if you are obviously in the R&D phase, it's not going to be needed yet. In phase 2, when you're really defining your product and your quality metrics, you're still making small batches of product. You're really not at the scale where your customer is going to need to see that HACCP plan. But oftentimes like you're saying, that phase 3 is probably when you'll want to create it, because you're on the verge of scale. So if you're going to be moving to that, working through a distributor, let's say, or getting on that Whole Food shelf, and then you're going to need the HACCP plan, and definitely don't wait until phase 4, to do that. Your co-packer will have to have that plan if you're moving to a co-packer. And that's obviously something that you do in phase 4, but if you're not planning on moving to a co-packer, you got to sort that out in phase 3.
And if you have it done already in your phase 3 and you're planning to work with a co-packer, that becomes such a strategic conversation. When you're interviewing for your co-packers, can you meet these criteria? And you know exactly what to look for in terms of documentations. You can ask the right questions to identify the proper co-packer for your need. HACCP plan seems like it's these busy work, right? If you're not familiar, but it's actually not, because in the end, it actually will save you money, because you know how to control your equipment, you know what needs to be done so that you can produce products consistently. At the very least, some of the things that is usually done as part of a HACCP plan is equipment maintenance, right? And so if you don't think labor is important, but having lying down and not producing is lots of money, right? So
love that. Do you just put this information in a Google Doc or a Word doc, or do you have any recommendations on the how to document and sort of how to share this information with your internal team and then potentially your external team?
It's as simple as putting it onto a Microsoft Word and then share it onto your Google Doc. Usually what happens by phase 3 or by phase 4 is that your processes are locked in place, right? So when you approach that level, you want to make sure that you have control of your documentations, whether you do it by revisions, changes, or you basically create your document and lock it so no one can make changes. But aside from that, a Google Drive is good enough.
Okay. And then just be careful to document all of the key things throughout the process of receiving your inputs and literally everything. Think through every phase, every phase of a phase, every phase of creating your product.
Exactly. And I think even as part of the HACCP plans, I know, at least again, in my previous industry, we talk about how do you make sure you control your documentation, right? And so, because it'll change over time, just because it is what it is.
Right.
But how do you control it, and how do you make sure that you have a high level amount of assurance that your product is produced with that particular provision?
Yeah. This has been so insightful to it seems like obvious information, right? You start with an idea and then you move through the phases of turning your idea into something that is sellable and repeatable. And then you scale up your batches, and then you continue to grow and you continue to scale. But I think having it laid out in phases like this of here's what you should really be accomplishing and focusing on and documenting at each phase can be really, really helpful for a lot of people. Obviously, it's sort of an easier said than done kind of thing, I think. And what I'm thinking of particularly is the hiring of team members, the training of team members. And I know, a lot of people have dealt with this struggle of no one does it as fast as me, right? When you're handing off the responsibility of making chocolates or, mixing dough or, making handmade pastries as one of our clients does. It's like, so this is really fun because this is a series of podcasts that we're doing together. And I'm sort of teeing up episode 2 here because within these 4 phases, when you're bringing on team members and you're handing off responsibilities to them, we need to have expectations that are realistic. We also need to have standards that they meet to ensure that, we're producing our product as efficiently as possible and that we're, spending efficiently and working efficiently. So I'm really excited to dive into how we successfully onboard new employees and how we sort of set the standards, but don't have too high of an expectation of them.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So if you've enjoyed this episode, if you've identified where you are within the 4 phases and you're interested in learning about things like what a time study is and how to do a time study and how to interpret your findings and communicate them to your team so that you are all on the same page, that you have appropriate expectations for them, and they have standards for production in terms of time and efficiency, then you are not going to want to miss out on the next episode. It's airing in 2 weeks. Charlotte and I will be back. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining me here today.
You're welcome.
All right. I'll talk to you. You're welcome. And I'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Join Charlotte and I as we take this conversation to the Good Food CFO community. We've got 2 full-length bonus episodes where Charlotte shares how to maintain quality and consistency as you expand your team and how to identify and overcome bottlenecks in your systems to maximize efficiency and profitability. Charlotte's also sharing templates for translating your customer desires into processes that will consistently meet those desires, and her time study template. If you want to hear those episodes and grab those downloads, become a Good Food CFO Plus or Revolutionary member today. There's a link in the show notes, or you can visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on membership levels to learn more. As always, I am so grateful to have spent time with you here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and consider rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help more good food founders find the show. I'll be back with a brand new episode in 2 weeks.